My name is Gregor Thum. I'm associate professor of history working on modern Central European history, but I will be just the moderator of this session, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests, two eminent scholars, not only working on Slovakia, but also who are based in Slovakia. In that capacity, they are experts, and they are also eyewitnesses, agents of the process, which we also talk today. So EU enlargement was not just a single event that just happened in 1 year. It was actually a very long process that started much earlier, long before 2004, and it lasted after. It's a continuous process. The European Union is not chiseled in stone. It's a moving thing. It's a moving target. It's constantly changing. And of course, each enlargement also changes the European Union. So to start with my introduction, we have here, and I welcome Miloslav Bahna. He is a senior researcher and currently director of the Institute of Sociology at the Slovak Academy of Sciences in Bratislava. His research focuses on international migration, quantitative comparative sociology, and quantitative survey methodology. He is also a long-term representative of Slovakia in the International Social Survey Program. And we have here Michal Vašečka, is a sociologist by background and focuses his research on issues of ethnicity, race, anti-Semitism, as well as migration studies. He is program director of the Bratislava Policy Institute and associate professor at the Bratislava International School of Liberal Arts. Dr. Vašečka also serves as the representative of Slovakia in the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance at the Council of Europe. So we're really happy and very proud to have both of you here, and that you can share, your expertise, your knowledge about the process, and of course also your personal experience. The structure, how we want to have it, we have for each of our experts, of our guests, 5 to 10 minutes to make a beginning statement to describe the process, what the thoughts they have, and to think about the European Union enlargement after 20 years. And then we just enter in a conversation and about those topics. So thank you very much. Welcome here in Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, only on Zoom, not in person, but that's much better than not meeting at all. So thank you for being here. And I'd like to turn the mic to Miloslav Bahna at the beginning with this beginning statement.
Okay, hello. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you for the opportunity to start with my opening statement. When Gregor suggested this framework, I was thinking about what are the three main ideas which come into my mind when speaking about Slovakia's European EU membership. And I think it would be important to stress that to understand the role of EU membership with Slovak history or in Slovak history in the development of Slovak society, we have to go back to the 90s and the experience with the authoritarian leaning government of Vladimir Mečiar in the early and later 90s. Because of this experience made the EU membership a very desired goal for part of the Slovak society, for, let's say, the more liberal part of society, opposed to these authoritarian tendencies of the post-1989 political scene in Slovakia. And also an important moment was the fact that the NATO enlargement in 1997, Slovakia was left out of this process. So but we were the only country out of the V4 countries, out of the Visegrad countries, where I just add to the context that Visegrad countries are Central European countries, are a group of Central European countries, including Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary. While Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary were admitted as NATO members in 1997, Slovakia was described as a hole in the middle of Europe, as a black hole in the middle of Europe by Foreign Secretary Madeleine Albright, and this was perceived as something which we didn't manage to achieve while our closest neighbors were able to achieve. It's in this light and in the light of the development and later ousting of the authoritarian leaning government of Vladimir Mečiar in 1998, becoming the EU member in 2004, together with our neighbors, finally kind of getting into the European Union at the same time as our neighbors, which already were members of NATO, like 7 years ago. And this way, membership in the EU was portrayed not as something which was, in a way, had to be an automatic process, or was something which happened just naturally, as it was perhaps perceived in the Czech Republic or in our other neighboring countries. But for Slovak society, or for the parts of the society which participated actively in ousting the regime of Vladimir Mečiar, this has become an important part of the narrative, of the national narrative, that we made it from the laggard, from someone who was not admitted to NATO as suffering democratic deficits, to someone who was able to eventually be faster afterwards and catch up with our neighbors who were on track to become EU members before us, and eventually we made it in the same time slot. So that's perhaps the first area which is important to stress with regard to the Slovak context. I have two more kind of general contextual points which I think are important with regard to the discussion about new EU members, or so not even a question if we should speak about Slovakia, our neighbors, our neighboring countries as new EU members, like, since this is a lecture series dedicated to the 20th anniversary of becoming member. The EU enlargement of 2004 has largely been a story of convergence. A story of convergence with regard to wage levels, with regard to living standards, with regard to GDP. The bloc as a whole has grown more similar with regarding to all these features, like the wage difference between the poorest country in the EU and the most affluent one in 2004 or 2003, before the accession, was let's say 20 times higher. The wages in Luxembourg were 20 times higher than wages in Bulgaria. Well, currently the difference is only 6 times. So the convergence has been quite large and quite pronounced. A similar convergence could be observed with regard to GDP and so on. So in these economic terms, the European Union bloc has become much more, let's say, equal, or the wealth distribution has become more equal. And a third point I was thinking about, which is worth mentioning, and it's connected to my expertise as a migration scholar, is the fact that, in fact, after 2004 and now 20 years after 2004, the European Union is actually smaller than it was before 2004 due to Britain leaving the European Union. It's not smaller with regard to population size, since the population of the new EU members, which became members after 2004, and then eventually Romania, Bulgaria joined in 2007, and then Croatia joined in 2013. But it's smaller in terms of GDP and in terms of economic output. So the current EU, even though having a lot more members than it had in 2004, is in economic terms is a smaller bloc than it would have been if UK had stayed in the EU, and new EU members and the Central Eastern European countries would not have become members. And why I'm mentioning this, because I'm saying one of my thesis this evening would be that these two events are connected, and the Brexit referendum was very much decided. The thin majority which was achieved by the Leave campaign was achieved due to two things: bad timing of the referendum, which happened just at the time where the wave of Bulgarian and Romanian immigrants peaked in the UK, and the new statistics kicked in, which were very playing much in favor of the argument of the Leave campaign, like we have to retain control about our borders and we cannot control people coming from the EU since we are EU members. And this has been also confirmed in empirical evaluations, where not the size of immigrant population per se, in parts of the UK, but rather the increase in immigration, which was mostly driven by new EU members' immigration in the UK, is one of the explaining actually variables explaining the vote for leave and for the Brexit referendum. Okay, so I'm following the times. I'm finishing here, and we might go then deeper in some of these points. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and Miloslav, for doing this. You really opened so many questions. We can also deepen that, and just the connection between EU member or EU enlargement and NATO enlargement is of course very critical to mention that too. And yeah, and thank you also for Brexit, to make the connection also here and pointing to migration. And you talked about the conversion, and we have time to talk about this too. And you said, of course, that Slovakia was a relatively poor country at the beginning, but it's just also to keep that in people's mind that Slovakia today is the biggest car producer in the world by capita. So when you think about European cars, many of those European cars come actually from Slovakia, and that's an amazing success story in this regard. So this is what you, of course, mean with this very dramatic conversion. Yeah, I'd like to turn then the word to Michal Vašečka for the opening statement, and then we get into a conversation.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to this online seminar. By the way, just 2 months ago, I was in person in Pittsburgh, so I had a lecture at the University of Pittsburgh, although that was connected with the Department of Slavic Studies and the only Slovak language department in the United States. I hope that I will stick to time equally as Miloslav. I'll do my best. And let me begin by personally experiences with the European Union enlargement. We are scholars, but I hope that this is important. Before 1989, and I was born in 1972, I was dreaming my personal dream that Czechoslovakia will return to Europe. I was influenced, since 1986 or 87, very much by Kundera's essay, Kidnapping of Central Europe. And that was exactly what I felt when I was 15, 16, that basically I'm living in a country that was kidnapped by somebody to the east, where it doesn't belong. In this sense, and honestly speaking, I was planning to emigrate from communist Czechoslovakia. So by now I might have been living somewhere in Pittsburgh if the change of the regime didn't come. But fortunately, revolution of 1989 changed everything from the scratch, and all of our countries of the region started to materialize all those dreams from the past. The slogan "Return to Europe" was the main driving force of everything what we were doing, everything what we were dreaming of that time. And by the way, it even contributed to the splitting of Czechoslovakia to a certain extent. When Vladimir Mečiar, who was mentioned by Miloslav already, became prime minister in 1992, some of Czechs were mentioning basically together to Balkans or alone to Europe. So this is how they wanted to justify the splitting of Czechoslovakia, because they were afraid that simply Czechoslovakia might follow the path of Yugoslavia and turn into civil war. Later, Slovakia, exactly as Miloslav was saying, chose a very different path of transition. And in the years 92-98, we became, as Madeleine Albright mentioned, in 1997, black hole of Central Europe. And our transformation was very different in comparison to the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. But again, the perspective of the European Union enlargement, perspective of becoming European country, or if you want, Western country, which meant not only prosperity, but also rule of law, liberal democracy, and eventually inclusive society, was a driving force of rejection of Mečiar's regime in 1998. and Slovakia started to catch up with other parts of Central Europe. And it was difficult and dramatic. We had to close many chapters with the European Union very quickly. Some Polish, Czech, and Hungarian experts were even saying in 1999, you will not make it. We are negotiating already for 3-4 years. You are not going to make it. The truth is that not only we made it, but we made also some mistakes because we were closing those chapters with the Brussels sometimes very quickly. Good example is agriculture. Poles were negotiating agriculture for 7 years, and they were tough negotiators. Slovaks closed the chapter in 1 month. Consequently, our agriculture sector and our agrarian producers have the worst conditions out of all new member states that were invited in 2004. So it had also some problematic sides here, definitely. But the result was spectacular. The Slovakia got not only into the Schengen very quickly. My kids. My daughter is 22, my son is 20, and they don't understand what is passport. When we traveled to the United States, they were shocked that we are using passports because they are using IDs, or very often not even IDs. It's absolutely new generation. Slovakia is in the Eurozone. They don't remember Slovak crowns. They are genuine Europeans in all aspects of the world. And those who are coming from urban areas, I believe that they are European also, not only in material sense, but also in a spiritual sense. But there are some problems here. Euro funds that Slovakia was utilizing in last years are very often becoming one of very few tools how to modernize the country. Let me give you an example. 85% of all development funds are coming from Euro funds. So in other words, without structural funds coming from taxpayers from Germany and the Netherlands and some other countries, Slovakia would be not expanding. We simply don't have money for building infrastructure that would be compatible with the so-called West. But that's also saying something about Slovakia at the same time. Let's not be over-optimistic here. And consequently, I must say that Slovakia was joining European Union as the most Euro-optimistic country out of all. And Miloslav can confirm that they have a data, in last 20 years, there was practically no opposition against European Union membership 19 years ago in Slovakia. Vast majority of people, over 90%, were basically saying that this is a good step. Now it's not, picture is slightly more gloomy. Only 52% of people, according to our survey from February of this year, 52% of Slovaks appreciate our membership in the European Union as something what Slovakia is benefiting from. So it means 48% are saying something else. But we should put it into a certain context. Hey, 50% at the moment of people in Slovakia are not particularly happy about the change of November 1989. They have quite serious objections to the whole transformation process that took place in Slovakia. And speaking about the European Union, as many as 36% of people in our survey would, in an eventual referendum about leaving European Union, vote in favor of leaving European Union. Don't be scared now. There will be no referendum. Slovakia is not going to leave European Union. That's clear. But somebody might say, hey, this is just slightly more than 1/3 of society. But I'm saying, yes, that's true. And I wouldn't be scared here. But the truth is also that the number is slowly but systematically rising in last years. Very slowly, but systematically. So, and I'm looking at the time. So let me just finalize it with a question. Why is that? Why suddenly country which was the most Euro-optimistic turned to relatively Euro-skeptic? The first, and we can discuss it later on, there are some historical reasons. Slovakia was, unlike many other countries in the region, relatively benefiting from real socialism, from the agrarian country changed into highly developed country, which was one of the pearls of Animal Farm together with East Germany that time. So Slovaks, in fact, we're not appreciating changes of 1989 so much as Poles or Czechs, and there is a good reason for it. We might understand it very well. Secondly, and we might discuss it in details, we should also speak about certain type of civic and political culture that we have in Slovakia, which is not comparable to with some of countries of the Western Europe. Still, that civic culture, I'm referring to, of course, famous theory from the 60s, Almond and Verba, is still a little bit authoritarian, or some might even say that to a certain extent it's parochial, typical for tribal communities, and in this respect, you can find it in Poland, you can find it definitely in some of Balkan countries, but not so much in the Czech Republic, which of course went through very different type of modernization in comparison to Slovakia. And we can go on. It has a certain impact on egalitarianism of Slovaks, anti-intellectualism, anti-elitism, which of course is influencing also our views of the European Union. There is also a structural reason, which is very simple. Slovakia still, in spite of the massive urbanization in the last 70 years, is still relatively the most rural country of Central Europe. When Czechoslovakia was established 105 years ago, the biggest city was Bratislava with 120,000 people. The second, Košice, had 40,000. And the rest were very small cities, very small towns, and basically villages, rural areas. So in this respect, of course, a country which is still, to a certain extent, rural by heart, is viewing some of structural changes, paradigm changes that are happening in the Western world, with less optimism, with certain skepticism. I mean, it's typical for most of rural areas. Now I'm thinking about the United States, and we basically know where we are. Important, fourthly, and I'm almost at the end. Very important thing, speaking about identity, is that Slovakia, because of the very natural reasons, as a very young country and a young nation, that's important also as an emancipated nation, is still somehow locked in the cage of nationalism. And I'm not saying it negatively. I'm just referring to, let's say, Stuart Hall, who was describing how in a process of globalization, our identities are being pluralized, how some people are strengthening their national identities, but others are strengthening particular identities, universal identities, or even hybrid identities. In this respect, Slovakia, being European or having European identity is very often portrayed as losing Slovak identity. And in 21st century, obviously, you can have both, or you can have many of them. As let me give you my example to be precise. I have a Bratislava identity, I have a Western Slovak identity, I have a Slovak identity, I even used to have Czechoslovak identity, I have Central European identity, and also cosmopolitan identity. And these identities are not clashing inside of me, it's perfect, they are perfectly compatible. But the environment is still growing into it. And I'm absolutely positive that it will come very soon. So because Slovakia is changing these days very much and is being pluralized dramatically. And lastly, why we see certain reluctance to accept European Union more positively? Because enemies of open society were influencing the attitudes toward the European Union and towards European identity systematically in last 30 years. They were poisoning wells, I would say, and very successfully. Slovakia at the moment is very conspiratory, basically it got stuck in this conspiracy hell. And unfortunately, part of it is also strong anti-European narratives. And having said that, and this will be my last sentence, and on purpose, I left it as a last sentence, Slovakia is, because of many reasons, very vulnerable as a part of the European Union, and the Russian Federation focused on Slovakia. And this is not that I believe in it, but unfortunately we have even information of intelligence services, and we have data about it, how Russia focused on Slovakia and invested a lot of money into poisoning basically Slovakia and Slovak inhabitants, and very successfully. And why they are doing it? It's very simple. Russian Federation identified Slovakia, and I believe rightly so, as the weakest part of the chain in the European Union, and they are always focusing on the weakest part of the chain. And on purpose, I'm not saying it as the last reason, because Russian Federation wouldn't succeed if Slovakia would have been a different country. But the truth is that unfortunately, already very fragile situation was even worsened by this hybrid war, which was waged by Russian Federation in the last few years.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very rich opening statement with so many points you raised. I don't even know where to start, to go into that. And you talked about, again, about the stunning success of Slovakia, economic success, and not just economic, but also, political success, but also that Euroscepticism is on the rise also in Slovakia, which of course is not a Slovakian phenomenon. It's not even an East European, it's a European phenomenon now. We have it in different countries. Brexit, England is the most Western country, is the country with the Brexit and left first. So we see it's not a East European, a post-socialist thing, and it's a common thing. But of course, we do also have certain tendencies, and I want to ask you, and this is a question for both of you. Michal, you said, the feeling of how important it was for Slovakia to enter into European Union. There was the feeling of the return to Europe. And the return to Europe, and you referred to Mila and Kundera's text, and it's said, the kidnapped half of the continent. But the point of the text was also, of course, that it is Europe, right? It was there before. It is basically a critical part of Europe that was just missing. So the West Europeans were also missing a part of Europe, basically. So they were always in Europe. But the slogan was really important, not just for Slovakia, but also for Poland and for the Czech Republic and Hungary. This return to Europe, which was coined, I don't know exactly who coined the phrase, but it was a phrase that comes from the region, basically, and was embraced. What did people, and it's a question for both of you, what's your sense? What did people actually associate with Europe? It's a symbol, right? But what is that, what they had in mind when they talked about Europe? And of course, it's the common Europe they talked about. But what is it? And I want to get in the second question, we talk, what did actually West Europeans connect to that? Is there a difference or is the same thing? And that was my question. And since you talked just now, I would like to maybe for Miloslav to start with that question, if you feel comfortable with that question, with the return to Europe. What did Europe mean actually to you, to people? What is your sense?
Yeah, I totally agree with Michal on saying that the return to Europe was one of the key points or keywords in the 1989 change of regime and in the protests, and also like Bratislava being like the capital of Slovakia, being basically a border town lying on the border with Austria as well as with Hungary. Like from where I'm sitting now, I can be in Austria in 7 minutes if I jump on my car and drive there. So the experience of living in the border and the experience of Iron Curtain was pretty intense and could be felt like on a daily basis. So the return to Europe, there was one of the largest events in '89 on the border between Austria and Slovakia was an organized walk across the border to the other side of Danube and to have a look at the Devin Castle, which is just outside of Bratislava, from the other side, from the forbidden side of the Danube, to look at Slovakia from the other side of Europe, actually, from the Western. So I agree. Like the return to Europe was a very early slogan even at the protests in 1989. But you ask about like what it meant for people like becoming EU members, and
not what it means European. Yeah, exactly. So what did Europe stand for? Right, Europe is a catchword basically. But what does it mean? You know.
Like I'm not referring to specific like question survey results here, but I would say that the main point why people in Slovakia supported joining the EU that much was because it was connected with like becoming part of the affluent West, basically. So I would say the economic argument was the key to that, and in a way, the history ended in 2004 for the narrative of returning to Europe. So we finally were there, and in a way we were lost after that, because like the goal was achieved, and I'm afraid I've now.
No, that's fine. You're froze for a moment. You're freezing.
Hello, I probably lost the connection.
Yeah, but we hear you still. You just froze for a moment, but we could hear everything until just now. But now you seem to be frozen.
Yeah. I can hear you again. So
you're back. Okay.
I still remember where I was. So I was referring that 2004 was actually something as an end of the history in the sense as Fukuyama mentioned it in a different sense. But after that, I would say the political scene or also the wider public was in a way without a clear goal. Like what would we actually like to achieve once we are members of the EU? Which in a point in a way led to lean to certain disappointment, because we became European Union as before. For example, the Czech Republic was the reference point for Slovak society. Now it was a wider reference point. The whole European Union eventually was the reference point, and within this reference point, Slovakia, even though catching up and eventually growing faster in an economic sense as our neighbors or as our partners in the West, still the countries we started comparing ourselves with were always like the ones who were more successful, more affluent, more higher living standards. Whichever indicator you pick, the indicator is something which shows that Slovakia is at the bottom half or at the bottom quarter or even below that. So in a way, the end of history after 2004, a bit of the consensus slightly and slowly afterwards started to break apart, the political consensus that we would like to be EU members. And it's exactly the case as Michal said, that Slovakia entered the European Union as one of the most pro-European nations, one of the most pro-European publics, even though we barely made the threshold of participation in referendum. The referendum of agreeing to entering European Union in Slovakia was held in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, and there had to be a turnout of at least 50%. So we barely made it above the threshold. There were just 52% of people participating. Those who participated obviously voted like in a vast majority of them in favor of joining the European Union, but had a few thousand people less come to the referendum. The referendum would have to be repeated or whatever. So it would. So this was always like the high Euro optimism level was always connected to a relative passivity with regard to European institutions. Slovakia, like for several rounds of European elections, like was the country with the lowest turnout and lowest participation rate in the elections for the European Parliament. So it's always been a double-edged sword in that regard, this Euro optimism in Slovakia. And looking at the figures of support for being a member, I would say it's correct that we started pretty high. When I look at figures from 2006, we're approximately at the level of Poland. The Polish public was also pretty optimistic about joining the EU. And then we were declining together with the Poles until 2013. And then there was a disconnect. The Polish public started to be like Euro-optimistic again, a little bit more, while the level of support for EU stagnated in Slovakia, let's say until 2019. And then with the events connected with ousting the Prime Minister Fico and eventually the COVID crisis led to another further decline further decline of support for being EU member, and this is how we arrived at the situation which was described by Michal currently, where you have a sizable minority, but a sizable minority of people who think that EU is probably not a good thing for us, and this is pretty much connected, very much likely, to the influences which were already mentioned, but also with the connection which was made between, let's say, the liberal conservative like cleavage and the European Union being portrayed as someone who pushes forward the liberal agenda too much, and people who identify themselves as conservative started to make a connection between EU membership and things like LGBT plus rights and other liberal things which they seem to be not liking too much, and which also have been used by politicians as mobilizing tools, copying in many ways, like recipes and approaches which were also like successfully used by the far right in the Western world, or also, for example, by Donald Trump in the US.
Yeah, thank you. So you said one of the most important things that people associated with Europe, return to Europe, is also gaining prosperity. You know, this was importance of that. And of course, that's the curious point, and maybe then Michal can say something about this. Maybe you want to add to this also, if this was the only thing. But because if you think it was prosperity, that was really the one thing that really came. It took longer than maybe people thought. But when you think, you know, the Euroscepticism in countries where it's a strong, you know, we look at Poland, for instance, Poland is really prosperous, you know, in a sense, it really was successful economically, but there was still this rejection, or is coming this rejection. Always I like to emphasize, this rejection is also there in Western Europe in sections of society, right? It's not just the East European thing, but you have it quite pronounced in some East European countries. And how do we explain that if prosperity was what people wanted and they got it, but there must be something else that made them unhappy, or some sections of society? And you refer to this, that with European membership came also like a political agenda or a political program to adopt, and you referred, you know, to liberalism and all these elements of it. So I like to just the same question also, you know, to Michal, you know, what is your take on that? You know, so what causes the disappointment in some sections of society?
Miloslav mentioned many dimensions of it, which I would subscribe to. Let me add something. Remember in 1989, and it was reflected also in the first public opinion polls which were conducted, because let me remind our American colleagues that before 1989, public opinion polls were conducted in, let's say, state companies, you know, fluctuation of a labor force, blah, 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 but not really, you know, that type of public opinion polls as we know them these days. You know, the Communist Party basically was stating, I mean, long time ago in 50s, 60s, that we know how the working class is thinking about the world. You know, we don't need to investigate it. But remembering it at the beginning, of course, it was prosperity, but also something very important. People were mentioning normality. We want to live like normal people. So these, in other words, decency. People felt that simply we were living not a decent life, that somebody was manipulating with our lives. You know, that's like with a joke. And since Miloslav mentioned that we are living right on the border with Austria, so right next to the former Iron Curtain, there is a good joke. You know, the father with the son is standing in front of the Iron Curtain, and the son is asking, Daddy, who is on the other side? And Daddy is answering, we are on the other side. You know, there is a free world. We are on the other side. And people felt it, you know, and it was embarrassing. It was frustrating. So it was very much about decency. I personally, I was thinking that time about fulfilling my dream to live in a Western society, prosperity, but also rule of law, free and fair elections, and of course this decent society. And decent society is an inclusive society, which is behaving nicely to everybody. In this respect, it didn't really materialize completely. Rule of law is a problem still. I mean, we have a free and fair elections. Honestly speaking, sometimes I think that more fair than in the United States. But whether we are living
not much to say.
Yeah, I'm not sure we are living in a perfectly decent society, but it's definitely more decent than it was. But people lost these things. Many people, honestly speaking, as we were standing on a main square in Bratislava in November, December 1989, many people were dreaming about the free world, but in fact, they were dreaming about new coffee machine and a new TV set, and it was seen later to a certain extent. So in other words, in equally to this, European Union, and we realized it much later, in 2004 was seen as a potential cash machine by many. And exactly as Miloslav said, without having European identity, without being somehow attached to a European project, which was materialized later in a turnout in European parliamentary elections. I mean, think about it. 10 years ago, in European parliamentary elections, the turnout was 9.5. Lowest in the whole European Union. 4 years ago, 2019, it was almost spectacular for Slovakia, 22, which is still peanuts in comparison to many other countries. So this is not something what brings people to ballots. Simply, there is no polarization so far, and why the question, why is it? I still see it as a sociologist as a certain discrepancy between structural dimension of modernity and cultural dimension of modernity. It's everywhere in the world. Cultural dimension of modernity is always catching up with structural. Material life is progressing much faster than our minds. But in Slovakia, I see that the discrepancy is very visible. You have a very modern country structurally with a very good infrastructure, and if some of our American colleagues now are wondering what I'm speaking about, Slovakia has one of the fastest internet, in the world. Penetration of gas second in the European Union, and many other things that you would be actually surprised by the quality of it. But at the same time, cultural dimension of modernity, Slovakia is kind of a country which got lost in 20th century, which is just trying to enter 21st century. And this is about simply, in other words, about quality of life and demand for quality of life, not only in material sense. Now, especially in urban areas, this is rising, it's visible. Other dimension of quality of life, other than material, is everywhere. Not so much in rural areas, so the Caesars are relatively open, but again, it's just a question of time when it will reach the rest of society. It's almost inevitable. The problem here with the demand for quality of life in non-material sense is that it's connected also with certain understanding of human rights, if you want, minority rights. And in this respect, Slovakia is deeply in a history. And just to finalize what I wanted to say, very often people from the Western Europe or United States consider Slovakia of being backward. And to a certain extent, they might be right, but they are picking up wrong dimensions of it. Slovakia is not backward materially and structurally. And again, let me repeat it. You would be surprised positively. But unfortunately, you don't expect that we might be so rooted in traditional society in the 20th century, in something what many people in Western Europe take for granted. Several generations went through the education of human rights, inclusivity, etc. This is not our case. and we are lagging behind terribly. And I would say it might be 2 or 3 generations. During the communism, you know, we were speaking mostly about social dimension of our citizenship and about social rights. People understand social rights perfectly, but civic rights and political rights, that's something else. You know, people are not that mature as you might expect in a way.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is of course also the fact that many of those what can be described as modernity or modern life came, as you said, came very fast to the new member states, and processes that took much longer in Western Europe actually. So people got adjusted over time. But the accession into an existing body meant basically for all member states, new member states joining, they had to accept the whole package in one moment, basically. And that, of course, can explain also some of the rejection was there. And an example of this, and I would like also to talk about that topic, is, of course, also migration. You know, when I, for instance, we know that people probably all know that the attitude towards immigration is different in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. The tendency is different. You know, you have, for instance, a still more welcoming society in, let's say, West Germany, where people are used to that process, and the more welcoming than maybe you would find in Eastern Europe, welcoming to immigrants, refugees coming from Africa and so on. However, you know, when I think about the long process that labor migration to Western Europe, you know, Germany, Belgium, France, England, started, of course, in the 50s and 60s as a slow process. And then, of course, over time, and when we see, for instance, documentaries, opinion polls of the 50s and 60s in Germany, you would be surprised how racist and xenophobic people were at that time. But it was a long-term process. And over time, of course, they got completely used that just people of Turkish descent or Arab descent are just part of life. It's just normal. It's just part of it. And there's no conflict with that. So in this sense, and of course, for Eastern European countries, it's very different, because they didn't have an experience with immigration before, and suddenly it came as a wave, or it would be perceived as a wave. So, and I want to ask you both, you know, the experience of migration. So with the European Union membership, it means also the freedom of movement in all directions. So people could out-migrate and people could immigrate to Slovakia. And how did that actually change society? How did it challenge society? What effect does migration have on Slovak society? Do you want to start, maybe, Miloslav, with that?
Okay, if I may. Yeah, it's been a huge topic, I would say, in general, and for me personally. Like, I started as a scholar with studying like the post-accession migration flows, which were pretty large. Like per capita, the out-migration from Slovakia to the UK were on par with Poland's out-migration to the UK. Obviously, out-migration from Poland, since this is a bigger country, were much more visible. And once people were arriving from Central and Eastern Europe in the UK, this was mostly thematized in the British tabloids, let's say, as a Polish invasion. So the Slovaks and the people from Baltics got lost in this mix, but it was overwhelmingly interpreted as a Polish thing. But nevertheless, like per capita, this was a very important phenomenon for Slovakia. Just to provide a context, the context is important since in 2004, our Western neighbors, Austria and Germany, the countries which were the closest to the former Eastern countries, for the Central Eastern European new members, they decided to close their labor markets for a transitionary period for up to 7 years. And they used the whole period, which actually rerouted the migration flows towards UK and Ireland, which, based on their early kind of models and their assessments of how, if they can allow people to come freely from these new member states, and the predictions said that there will be a few thousand people coming in annually, so it's not a big deal. So based on such assessment, the UK and the parliament in the UK, like, they abstained from using the transition period. So from 1st of May in 2004, when Slovakia and the other 7 Eastern European members and Cyprus and Malta together, forming 10 countries, became member of the EU, you could, from the first day on, you could go to the UK and just start working there without work permit, without labor visa, whatever. So this was a very unique situation in a way, in a situation where you had 10 countries which had very different wage levels as the wage levels in the UK at the time. For Slovakia, the wage level in the UK in 2004 approximately 6 to 8 times higher than the average wage in Slovakia. Which, when we compare, for example, the most studied case of US-Mexico migration, which is the different wage difference between Mexico and the US was lower in the 80s than was this wage difference, which was there in place in 2004. So as a result, around 200,000 people from Slovakia took the opportunity and went to the UK and eventually were employed in the UK for at least a month. So they were picked up by the statistics, which I'm mentioning. But also at the same time, when I was looking at the data like 10 years later in 2014, one could say that 60% out of those who went to the UK in the first 10 years were already back in Slovakia after these years. And I assume the trend also continues since currently the Slovak diaspora in the UK is lower, particularly after Brexit and events related to this. But this story is very interesting and has it's a very close connection to what's happening in Slovakia currently. Slovakia has been a border country with Ukraine right after the crisis, as you're familiar. The smallest border or the shortest border of Slovakia is with Ukraine. And nevertheless, currently Slovakia houses approximately 100,000 people from Ukraine. Where you can hear Ukrainian in the streets of Bratislava. It's almost 10% of population of Bratislava who are people from Ukraine, like war refugees. And these people have been welcomed like pretty well. And this is a process which connects, which kind of creates, or it started already before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, when Slovakia was slowly but gradually approaching the status of a migration transition country, when the out-migration is eventually leveled out or equaled by in-migration from countries coming in. And this leads me to my last point here. You, Gregor, mentioned that Slovakia and let's say also Poland were successful with regard to economic transition and increasing the living standards. This is not necessarily how people perceive it in the country. People don't understand. I would say the average opinion is not that the economic situation in Slovakia is good enough, because the wages are always 3 times lower than in neighboring country, which is Austria. That's what I said. The reference frame is always and the mirror we look into it. It's always something that says it's better over there than it's in our country. That's why it was hard to believe for people for people in Slovakia, even the idea that foreigners from Western Europe could be interested in coming and working in Slovakia, which is also in part happening. At our institute, we already employ a few people from Western Europe, and actually their view or their observations of Slovakia are much more optimistic, I would say, than the views of fellow Slovak citizens. So structurally, the economic convergence has been a huge success, I would say. Let's say compared to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was diverging economically within its existence, and new members are definitely catching up. But at the same time, the populations of the EU members are not perceiving this as necessarily as good enough. So there is still a way to go to eventually be as affluent as the West. And perhaps the last point with regard to Michal, what he said, and how we try currently to grasp and explain where's this Euroscepticism coming from in Slovakia. I would say outside of these, the reason which were mentioned by Michal, and I think they play a role. I would say always look at current Slovak politics and understand the dynamics which happened after the assassination of the journalist Jan Kuciak, and after the major change of the let's say most talented Slovak politician, which is the current Prime Minister Robert Fico, who who became from a Euro optimist. He went through a transition and became very much riding the waves of all the currents which were flowing in the other direction than into EU core. So I would say that's also a very important part of the story, is the internal dynamics of Slovak politics after 2018 and particularly after 2020, which led to, let's say, the current results which we have in the opinion polls. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have to look a little bit at the clock already. We have 5 minutes left, but I would still turn it over also to Michal, about immigration, how you think the changes, the relevance of it for.
Well, that's you opened a Pandora's box here.
I can imagine.
5 minutes. That's terrible. and let me add something to what Miloslav said about perception of reality in Slovakia. Exactly, he's absolutely right. You might see Slovakia as a success story economically, definitely. I mean, there is no doubts about it. But people don't see it that way. In our research, in our public opinion poll from February, as many as 88% of people said that they consider economic situation in Slovakia as bad. That's outstanding. That's shocking. Even in the past, when the situation was really bad, they didn't see that the picture as gloomy as now. So reality is not important. What is important is perception of reality. But back to migration. It's exactly as you said. Of course, we can explain reluctance to accept migrants, refugees, de facto refugees in Slovakia. By the lack of experience, and we saw it in Western Europe. It also took some decades, but we would be on surface. This is definitely true, but there is much more to it. Slovakia, what is important here, Slovakia was always a migratory country, but which was always producing migrants, never receiving, generally speaking, yeah. And of course, many people were coming also to Slovakia, but the general perception of people is nobody really wants to live here. Everybody is just leaving. And rightly, 100 years ago or at the beginning of the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of Slovaks were leaving, by the way, mostly to Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and to these areas in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. And they were, by the way, perceived very badly. They were perceived as hunkies. There are various quotations from American officials that in case of hunkies, we deal with human trash. This is how Slovaks were perceived that time, 100 years ago. But this is not really playing any role in the consciousness of people, in the same way as some of people were behaving towards Slovaks 100 years ago in the United States. Slovaks equally behaved toward people from Syria some 7-8 years ago. I was ashamed by it, but of course this is very much connected to the fact that we believe that only we have the right to leave the country, which in the past was relatively poor. And why I'm mentioning it? Attitudes toward migrants, if you compare it with other countries of the European Union, and those of you who are following Eurobarometers, you are aware of it, are not very positive. But we should see it in a context of perceiving otherness in general, all others. And this is a problem which I believe is structural. Our type of nationalism in whole Central Europe, not only in Slovakia, is very exclusivist and blood-based. It came from Germany, but Germany these days is very much working on it. Germany already some 40-50 years, people like Habermas were mentioning how to set up new type of constitutional patriotism, how to overcome the ethnical exclusivism of Germans, because he said at that time, we Germans, we know better than anybody else that if we will be exclusivist and tough on these issues, it leads directly to Auschwitz. And this is exactly what was happening in Central Europe. The non-inclusiveness in these countries in the past led to solutions of the coexistence of various ethnic groups to deadlock in a way. We exchange inhabitants with our neighbors. We try to dramatically assimilate those people, or expel them from the country, or even to kill them, genocide. All these things unfortunately happened on this territory, and those countries became relatively homogenized. So one of the most heterogeneous part of Europe in the past became relatively homogeneous, and into this very freshly achieved homogeneous state, which people believed is the right form of existence, suddenly migrants are coming, and they are coming increasingly. And of course, so I believe that this is a structural reason connected to the way how we defined and how we constructed our nation in 19th century. So we have to open it somehow again, and to become more inclusive, and to restructure who we are, because without restructuring who we are, we will never be really inclusive. So I believe in this respect we have much greater problem than migratory countries such as the United States. And I know that I'm talking too much here, but simply Slovakia is in a paradoxical situation now, because we are lacking labor force dramatically in some of those car plants, in those factories, but at the same time we don't want to see any migrants. So you got stuck in between, two dramatic problems. So we are very often talking about increasing mobility of labor force, but we don't want to see migrants, and of course Slovakia will have to solve the problem, because otherwise it will be not successful even economically. We got basically stuck in our mind, which is coming from 20th century and 19th century.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We unfortunately have to really look at the clock. I feel we just got warm and we have to end already. And with migration, of course, it's also the point that people need to also see, hopefully, that immigration is a marker of success, actually, because only countries attract immigrants who are actually successful, and when people maybe can see that, and we know that the country with the highest share of immigrants in Europe is actually Switzerland. Probably sometimes are not aware of this very traditional country with, has the highest share of immigrants, and people can see that. I don't want to end before I give just a final word, for Miloslav, maybe, because it's just for, is there something you want to add at the very end, a perspective, 2004, is there something you can do? And 2024, what is the prospect of the European Union? Just briefly, optimism or pessimism, what is your idea of Europe?
I'm a bit actually worried because I think one of the reasons Czechoslovakia eventually split up was that the Czechoslovakia never formed a unified political community. Like from the very beginning, like there were two separate like political entities, and people were voting for different parties, and the discussion happened within each part of Czechoslovakia, and I think it's very similar currently in the European Union. So there is very little of like common European political policy, and very much national policies are also very instrumental with regard to how people view the European Union as a project. I mentioned it, like, for example, I would describe the current Euroscepticism mood in Slovakia mostly to the shift or the changes of one of the most popular Slovak politicians, which is Robert Fico. So that's why I'm a bit worried. But at the same time, with regard to immigrants and to the attitudes which also tend to be described as like inherited from the 20th century, and also from the homogeneous period. Currently, the experience, let's say, with the Ukrainian migrants, and also with the discourse about like the need of labor force and the need to open up, like at least for certain positions and so on. So this is currently already happening, and I don't see like any major backslashes against like these tendencies. Like people from India are starting working in Slovak car factories, which is a new thing. Yeah. So we were used to people from Serbia, let's say from Romania, but now like new countries are the headhunters of those companies are actually looking for people outside of the world. So I would say a challenge for Slovakia would be in the recent years, in the next years, like how to identify its position, what we want to achieve within EU. Part of perhaps the reason why so few people came to the votes, whatever, was that perhaps thinking that we are such a small country, we have just 13 MPs in the European Parliament, so they cannot really influence that much. So it was not seen as important, particularly perhaps. Also, these people are have low visibility, I would say, in the Slovak media discourse. When they become MPs in the European Parliament, they're not very active in the Slovak politics anymore. But generally, to end on a positive note, perhaps I would say like the experience with welcoming Ukrainian refugees perhaps could be pointing towards that even a country with the history of outmigration could eventually become a friendly place for people like suffering and fleeing from war, as currently is the case, even though like geopolitically the Slovak position is not particularly clear on which side of the fence the public stands. But I would say generally the welcome of and also the state support towards people coming from the Ukraine was pretty nice and should be acknowledged as positive.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. We're at the end. I think there are so many more questions I would have liked to ask, and maybe also the people who listen would I like to ask, but it's just a reminder how much there is to talk about this fascinating process of European integration. I mean, we conclude, with the sentence, we have created Europe. Now we have to create the Europeans who could really accept them of this body. And this is, of course, not an event. It's a long process and it's a big project. And it's an interesting project, a challenging project, but a very interesting, worthwhile project. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your insights, and wish you all who are here. Thank you for joining in today, and I wish you all a very happy afternoon, and for the people in Europe, a happy evening then. Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Goodbye, and thank you for the invitation, yeah.